General Medicaid warning. The views expressed in 5-ish minute lore, the lore delivered in rants, are sanctioned by their scholar Progenium as excess rageous. Prolonged exposure can result in loss of IQ, high blood pressure, random outbursts, and blunt force trauma to the skull, resulting in unconsciousness. Please consult your local physician for more information.
War Boss Grizguts. 40K's own deranged, homicidal Marty McFly.
You've got to come back with me!
Where?
Back to the future!
I can say without any reservation that the greatest weapon the orcs have besides sheer numbers is sheer surprise and disbelief. Rare is the experienced commander who puts anything past the orcs for the sake of sheer incredulity. If you're fighting the greenskins at any point, and the thought crosses your mind that the orcs wouldn't possibly do something, then that is the exact thing that you need to prepare for. The orcs have pulled off things that stretch the imagination. They have done things that flat out break the back of imagination. But there's been only one time in history that an orc actually did something for reasons so wildly bizarre it actually gave the orcs themselves an existential crisis. I'm talking, of course, about the Lost Waagh and the orc warlord Grizgutz. Grizzguts was your typical orc war boss, a ridiculously huge slab of green fungus that had his boys with him, and just wanted to set out to find himself what every orc wants: a good fight and a lot of loot. His favorite piece of gear that he had was his gun, and he apparently cherished this weapon more than anything. Also, while your average orc's idea of personal property can best be defined as might makes mine, Grizzguts takes the cake for the sticky fingers department. Grizzguts had zero issues walking up to any other orc and taking anything that he wanted, which for some reason gives him the designation as a kleptomaniac. In reality, if any orc had a problem with Grizzguts taking hold of something that up until that second was a cherished possession, they would have definitely found themselves in possession of a new item, a dented skull, in the size and shape of Grizzguts' fist. Yep, Grizzguts was your typical war boss in most every regard, with an even higher lack of the concepts of personal ownership than the rest of the fungal species. It's not known how orcs pick where they're going to go to find a fight. Grizzguts himself had his own decision-making process, and he wound up launching his formidable Waagh directly into the Morlock system. As they prepared to exit the warp and brace themselves for a good old fight, the orcs were ready for anything. Warp travel is a funny thing. A good amount of times with a skilled navigator, most Imperial ships will enter their warp and exit their destination safely if nothing goes wrong. Of course, warp storms can cause issues, and there are sometimes the vagaries of the warp will cause the speed that you arrive from point A to point B faster or slower. Sometimes you might get lost. Sometimes you just might stay lost for centuries in real time, only to have just a few minutes pass in the warp. But as long as no general warp insanity happens, you will enter and leave the warp right around where you're expected to, just so long as your Geller fields stay up and your navigator doesn't have a stroke. Well, orcs don't have navigators. They do have psychers in the form of weird boys, but I'd rather get my toenails clipped by a great white shark on ketamine than rely on a weird boy to do anything approaching sane. Generally, orcs will fling themselves into the warp and just go. If the Geller field fails, who cares? If they wind up in a system with a ton of enemies, well, it's party time! As a matter of fact, I can't recall how the orcs even manage to navigate when they actually do want to get somewhere, which is both hilarious yet at the same time concerning. When Grizzguts' fleet dropped out of the warp, they were rather surprised not to be staring at some human world, not some Eldar craft world, not even a Tal world. They were staring at their own fleet. Grizzguts' Waagh had traveled back in time and had exited the warp only minutes before they had first left the system. This is normally when every Imperial commander in existence would have almost instantaneously voided their bowels, because the Waagh had literally doubled in size instantaneously. If any other force in the galaxy had done this, including the Imperium, you can bet your sweet ass that they would be trying to find any way to duplicate the results. Double the troops, double the ships, double the gear, and double the supplies. Imagine if this happened to Battlefleet Gothic. Imagine if this happened to the 88th Siege Army of Krieg. But then remember that this happened to the orcs. This is when we go from normal orc to maximum over orc. Grizzguts, upon seeing the fleet and figuring out what had just happened, immediately attacked. In order to maintain some cohesion in this confusing piss pit of a mess I'm about to enter into, I'm going to refer to the original Grizzguts I was talking about as the old G.
That is a good-looking beard you have there, sir!
And the fleet that they jumped into as Young Gs. OG's Waagh engaged Young Gs with zero fucks given about the space-time continuum, and OG immediately went to board Young G's flagship. Most of the other orcs were just trying to figure out exactly who they were shooting at, and if they were shooting at the right orcs or the wrong orcs. In the meantime, Young G and Old G were fighting tooth and nail. The rest of the fighting quickly became a jumbled mess. No one knew who they were fighting or why they were fighting, and eventually no one knew what side they were on. Meanwhile, Old G and Young G continued to battle it out on one of two identical flagships. Blood and fungus bits were everywhere, but ships began to slow, orcs stopped bellowing, and all around the twin fleets, orcs tried to figure out exactly what the hell they were doing. The orcs were so confused, the orcs stopped fighting. Let me say it again. The orcs stopped fighting. The unstoppable green tide of the orc wall was cresting as the orcs stood slackjaw in pure confusion. The sheer, undeniable power of the what was absolutely destroyed by the power of the what? Meanwhile, on the bridge of Young G's flagship, the identical war bosses continued to brawl before finally Young G fell to the ground dead. Old G reached down to the body of his slightly younger self and grabbed something. Orcs looked at each other and shrugged. Ships turned and began moving off in different directions. Orcs tried to bellow out their war cry, but mid-vocalization they would just stop and scratch their heads, trying to figure out what in the name of Gork and Mork was happening. The Waagh energy that fueled the orc war machine bled away quickly as the Waagh itself drifted into non-existence a ship at a time. And on the bridge of the younger Grizzguts flagship, the surviving older Grizzgut smiled as he lifted up an identical copy of his favorite gun. Because of course he did. Because of course he would. Grizzguts' entire Waagh fell apart, even as Grizzguts himself happily set an identical copy of his favorite gun on his mantle. Grizzguts now had a spare of his favorite gun. Grizzguts was a very happy orc.